The crate was sitting in Bays 7 of the Cairo Museum's Eastern Receiving Dock when the head registrar signed off on it. That was September 4th, 1923. The entry was clean, neat handwriting, ink that hadn't faded yet when researchers first photographed the ledger page in 1987. Crate reference C1923-114. Dimensions 41 inches by 22 inches by 19 inches. Weight at intake 63 kilograms. Origin listed simply as Southern Excavation Transit. Recipient Department, Internal Classification, Sublevel Antiquities. That was the last official record anyone made of it. Not the last time it appeared in the building, the last time anyone in an official capacity wrote its number down and meant it. What was inside that crate has never been formally described by the Cairo Museum, the Egyptian Antiquities Service, or any colonial-era British excavation body in Egypt in 1923. In 63 kilograms of documented, stamped, signed for cargo, not a single object was ever catalogued. Not one artifact was assigned a museum accession number. Not one item from crate C1923-114 appeared on any outgoing transfer manifest, any auction record, any loan document, or any export license issued through the Cairo Customs Authority that year or the 4 years following. 63 kilograms of something arrived in the Cairo Museum in September 1923, and then the record simply stopped.
To understand why that gap matters, you need to understand what September 1923 actually looked like inside that building. The Cairo Museum, in the months following Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, was not a calm institution. It was a pressure point. Excavation teams from 6 different national bodies were operating across the Nile Valley simultaneously. The Egyptian Antiquities Service, still operating under partial French administrative control at the time, was processing incoming field materials faster than its classification staff could manage. A transit backlog of over 400 individual items had accumulated in the Eastern Receiving Dock alone between January and August of that year, according to an internal workload report filed by Deputy Registrar Emile Fontaine on August 29, 1923, 5 days before crate C1923-114 was signed in. Fontaine's report, held in the French Colonial Administrative Archive under reference FAEGY 1923-088, noted that 3 members of the classification staff had been temporarily reassigned to the Tutankhamun processing team, leaving the general intake department operating at less than half capacity. In that environment, a crate could sit, a crate could be deferred, a crate could, theoretically, be overlooked. But C1923-114 was not overlooked. It was signed in, weighed, dimensioned, given a reference number, assigned to a receiving department. That is not an oversight. That is an intake. Something came through the front door of the Cairo Museum on September 4, 1923, and someone made sure it was documented. What they did not do was tell anyone what was inside it.
The first person to notice the gap was not an archaeologist. He was an inventory clerk. His name was Yusuf Khalil Matta. He worked in the Cairo Museum's Internal Records Office from 1919 until sometime in late 1924, at which point his employment file simply ends without a resignation letter, a termination notice, or a forwarding address. One recorded reference to Matta survives outside the museum's own administrative files, a single paragraph in the private correspondence of British field surveyor Arthur Denholm, written in a letter to his brother dated March 1924, and now held in the Denholm family collection at the University of Edinburgh Special Collections, catalogued under MS-DEF-1924-C.
In that paragraph, Denholm describes a conversation he had with a museum clerk, unnamed in the letter, but whose description matches Matta's employment record, who told him that a crate received in September had been, in Denholm's transcription of the conversation, entered and then deliberately unfinished. The clerk's words, as Denholm recorded them, were that the intake form had been completed up to the point of content description, and then the content field had been left blank, not accidentally, not in a rush, but left blank in the way that a man leaves a field blank because he has been told to. Denholm apparently asked what was inside. The clerk told him he didn't know. He had never been permitted to open it. That letter sat in the Edinburgh collection for 61 years before anyone flagged it in connection with the C 1923-114 reference.
When independent heritage researcher Claudia Reinhardt cross-referenced the Denholm letter against the Cairo Museum intake ledger in 1985, she did not expect to find anything. She was working on a broader project documenting colonial-era artifact transit irregularities across North Africa, a study that eventually became a 1989 monograph published by the Institute for Mediterranean Heritage Studies. But the ledger entry stopped her, because crate C 1923-114 had a second anomaly that didn't appear in any summary description of the record. It wasn't the missing content field, it was a notation in the margin. 3 characters, written in a different ink than the rest of the entry, written by the appearance of the pen pressure and angle by a different hand entirely. The notation was R.O.V. Reinhardt spent 4 months trying to identify what R.O.V. meant within the Cairo Museum's 1923 administrative notation system. She contacted the museum directly. She filed requests with the Egyptian Antiquities Authority. She wrote to the British Museum's archive liaison, who had access to colonial-era correspondence between British excavation bodies and Egyptian institutions. Every inquiry came back with the same answer. The notation R.O.V. did not correspond to any documented abbreviation in the Cairo Museum's official classification system for 1923 or any adjacent year. It was not a standard code. It was not a departmental abbreviation. It was not a shipping or customs marking. Someone added 3 letters to the margin of an intake form in different ink with a different pen, and no one in the official record ever explained what they meant. Here is where the mainstream explanation would typically land. Archival irregularities in colonial-era Egyptian institutions are not rare. The intake process in 1923 was genuinely overwhelmed. Staff were reassigned, records were backlogged, and the administrative pressure of the Tutankhamun discovery created documented chaos across multiple departments. A missing content field could be a clerical deferral that was never completed. The R.O.V. notation could be a personal shorthand used by a single staff member that was never formally recorded in any system guide. Yusuf Khalil Matta's disappearance from the employment record could be explained by the routine personnel turnover that characterized colonial-era institutional staffing across the region. All of that is possible. But here is what that explanation cannot account for. In 1987, a team of archival researchers from the American University in Cairo conducted a systematic review of all unresolved intake entries in the museum's 1919 to 1926 ledger series as part of a broader heritage documentation grant. They identified 11 entries with incomplete content fields across the entire 7-year period. C 1923-114 was one of them. The other 10 were all resolved. For each one, supplementary documentation existed somewhere in the system,
a later classification card, a transfer record, an outgoing manifest, a researcher's field note that allowed the item or items to be traced forward. In 9 of the 10 remaining cases, the objects had been formally cataloged within 6 months of intake. C 1923-114 alone had nothing. No supplementary card, no classification follow-up, no transfer record, no mention in any outgoing document in any archive the 1987 team was able to access. Out of 11 incomplete entries across 7 years, 1 was completely and permanently unresolved. 1 crate, 1 blank field, 1 set of unexplained initials in the margin, and then silence that has lasted over a century.
Claudia Reinhardt made one more discovery before her monograph went to press. While reviewing outgoing transit records from the Cairo Customs Authority for the period September 1923 through December 1923, she found a single export license issued on November 17, 1923, for a consignment described in the license documentation only as institutional research materials, non-antiquity classification. The consignment was authorized under a cultural exchange provision that had been established between the Egyptian Antiquities Service and a private European research body in 1921. The receiving institution listed on the license was the Harwick Institute for Historical Studies in Geneva. Reinhardt contacted the Harwick Institute in 1988. The institute confirmed it had received a consignment from Cairo in late 1923. It confirmed the consignment had been logged into its own internal records upon arrival. It confirmed that the consignment had subsequently been moved to off-site storage in 1931 as part of a general archive consolidation. When Reinhardt asked to review the original intake record for that consignment, the Institute told her the 1931 consolidation records for that storage category had been lost in a fire at the off-site facility in 1943. The Geneva consignment, the 1931 transfer, the 1943 fire, all of it documented, all of it irretrievable. Every single paper trail that could have identified what left Cairo in November 1923 ended in ash. The Harwick Institute for Historical Studies closed permanently in 1961. Its remaining active archive was divided between 2 Swiss universities and a private foundation whose current operating status is listed as dormant. The off-site storage facility, destroyed in 1943, was located in a district of Lyon, France, that suffered significant structural damage during the German occupation. Records of what burned in that facility and what survived have never been comprehensively reconstructed. Yusuf Khalil Matta, the clerk whose employment file ends without explanation in late 1924, left no known descendants in any Egyptian civil registry that has been searched in connection with this record. His name appears once more in a 1925 Cairo city directory listed at a residential address in the Shubra district with no occupation noted. After that, nothing. Arthur Denholm, the British surveyor, whose private letter preserved the only surviving account of a conversation about the crate, returned to England in 1925 and died in Dorset in 1949. His remaining personal papers beyond the Edinburgh collection were disposed of by his estate. 3 people touched the edges of this record: a clerk who vanished, a surveyor who recorded 1 conversation and moved on, a researcher who published 1 paragraph about it in a 1989 monograph that has been out of print since 1997. The crate itself has never been found. Its contents have never been named. The R.O.V notation has never been explained.
The November 1923 Geneva consignment has never been connected to C. 1923-114 by any official body, because no official body has ever formally investigated the connection.
What sits inside the gap of crate C1923-114 is not necessarily one object. 63 kilograms is not a small weight. It is not a single artifact wrapped in cloth. It is a collection, a grouping, something that required a crate 41 inches long and weighed as much as a grown man. Whatever it was, someone knew its contents well enough to leave the content field blank on purpose. Someone added 3 letters to the margin in a different ink. Someone arranged for a consignment to leave the country 2 months later under a classification that placed it outside the jurisdiction of the Antiquities Authority entirely. And then the paper trail ended in a fire in a city under occupation, in a decade when records across the entire continent were disappearing for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology. The question that Claudia Reinhardt ended her 1989 chapter with has never been answered. She did not ask what was inside the crate. She asked something more precise than that. She asked who, in September 1923, had the access, the authority, and the specific institutional knowledge required to receive a 63-kilogram consignment at the Cairo Museum, assign it a valid reference number, and simultaneously ensure that no one with classification authority would ever be asked to open it.
That question has been sitting unanswered for 35 years since she wrote it, and for 100 years before she did. The Cairo Museum's Eastern Receiving Dock is still operational. The 1923 intake ledger, or what remains of it, is held in a restricted administrative archive that has not been opened to independent researchers since 2009. The reason cited for that restriction is conservation. Whatever came through Bay 7 on September 4, 1923, was important enough to document and important enough to never describe. That combination, precise record, empty content, is not confusion, it is decision. Somewhere between Cairo and Geneva, between 1923 and 1943, between a clerk who disappeared and a fire that closed the last door, 63 kilograms of something moved through the world's most scrutinized archaeological moment without leaving a single named object behind. The record was kept. The contents were not. Ask yourself what that distinction was worth to the people who made it, and whether anything that crossed an official threshold in that era, unnamed and unexamined, has ever truly stopped moving.